Today is 5/3/2024 at 10:01. I am here with,
Dean Hileman.
and what was your occupation or former occupation?
So I was a lieutenant with the California Department of Fish and Game, which is now the California Department of Fish and Wildlife. And I have 42 years with the department. My first 5 years was as a reserve game warden. Then I worked roughly 23 years in the law enforcement division, ending up being the supervisor for San Luis Obispo and Monterey counties. And then since 2010, when I retired, I continued to work part-time for the department in our professional standards unit in hiring and doing background investigations.
And where are you from?
I'm from Morro Bay, born and raised.
How long have you been on the water or around it? Was that your first career choice, going to fish your game in the water, or
So Fish and Game was my dream job. I always wanted to work for Fish and Game. I had grown up around the son of game warden in Morro Bay as a young boy and through elementary school and high school, and that was very influential in my choice to go to Fish and Game. And I think I was on the water probably at age 10 when I got my first boat and was out fishing. I loved halibut fishing. It was great. And also, rock cod.
what? Um, what was your first job on the water? Official job, maybe not just working for someone for fun, but the first official job.
Well, my first official job was with the Marine Patrol with the Department of Fish and Game. And I was assigned to the Marine Patrol with Fish and Game. First of all, working for about 5 years as a reserve officer when I first came on. I worked with the Marine Patrol and then had several assignments that took me into land assignments in southern Monterey County and then into the Sierras. And that was probably about 14 years before I got back to Morro Bay. And again, my life revolved around the oceans. So the land assignments were not probably my first choice. I enjoyed them, but I love the ocean and love fishing. And Morro Bay, like I say, is my hometown. And I was very fortunate to get assigned to Morro Bay on the Marine Patrol and then promoted to lieutenant there.
You mentioned that gap where you were working on land. How did you notice Morro Bay's changed when you came back? Both, I guess, physically, was there any physical change? Was there new buildings, or is there a difference in the makeup of the fleet, or something like that?
There was there's Morro Bay has experienced some growth over the years. The community is kind of limited. It's a population of about 10,000, and it's actually kind of stayed at 10,000. The reason being is there's just really no place for Morro Bay to grow. Its city limits are, where they are, and expanding the city limits is not something that I guess is an option. So the population stays about the same. There's new construction occurring, but a lot of times they're tearing down the old beach cottages that existed. So I've seen that change. The other change I think that is notable is, growing up as a kid, my classmates, many of their parents were in the commercial fishing industry. That was a big industry. What we've seen over time is the jobs that exist in Morro Bay have changed away from commercial fishing. Morro Bay is really turning into a retirement community. A lot of people coming up from Southern California and the Central Valley retiring to Morro Bay, and the jobs just aren't there, particularly related to commercial fishing. They're just not there anymore.
Why do you think that is? Is that just people moving out of the industry, or is that something restricting them?
So there's a number of factors I think that affect that. The fishery was wide open when I grew up. there weren't as many regulations at either the state level or the federal level, and certainly now there is. There's a lot more regulations. What we saw, so a couple examples. The federal regulations stepped in to regulate the deeper rockfish harvest by some of the more larger commercial fishing boats, and so the uh, National Marine Fisheries came in with regulations that limited a lot of those things. In 2006, I believe it was, an interesting thing happened. The uh, Nature Conservancy bought up um, uh, a number of the commercial fishing permits. And I believe there were seven trawlers in Morro Bay in 2006. And I believe that the Nature Conservancy purchased five of those permits, um, meaning they basically bought the boats, the permits. And my question was, well, why would the commercial fishermen sell the boats to the conservancy, who basically intended to retire those permits? Um, and part of it was that there were more regulations on coming down from the federal government on that particular industry, and so a lot of fishermen saw that this might be a time to get out, get the money that that was being offered from the Nature Conservancy, and essentially retire or move on to another industry. Um, that was the deeper water trawlers that were affected by those decisions. In the nearshore fishery, we had uh, when I came back to the Marine Patrol in 1999, we had, I believe, about 1,200 permits for nearshore fisheries. And what was happening was there were a lot of small boats that were had entered the industry with commercial fishing licenses. And when I say small boats, boats that were 12, 14 feet in length. So someone could basically go get a commercial fishing license and have a weekend hobby of making money, catching rockfish in the nearshore areas along the coast. And what was driving that was a new market that opened up overseas, where typically rockfish would sell for maybe $1 to $1.25 pound. All of a sudden, if you could keep the fish alive and get them back to Morro Bay, and they'd put them in a tank, you could get over $10 a pound, and that's a huge motivation for getting into that industry. The department had not regulated the number of permits that were in that industry at the time, and so all of a sudden, like I said, we have 1,200 boats in the Central Coast that were, or 1,200 permits that were in the Central Coast operating, and so around 1999, the department came in, and the California Fish and Game Commission and the state legislature enacted laws that said, had regulations that said, we're going to look at the people who were seriously in the industry, catching larger, catches, and we're going to let them keep their permits, but we're going to start weeding out the weekend warriors, so to speak. That 1,200 permits was having a pretty serious effect on the population of rockfish along the coast, and so that was the reason why those regulations came into play, and a number of regulations limiting where people can fish commercially, the number of pounds of fish that they can take in a particular quota, some size restrictions on the size of fish. All these regulations kind of came down the pipe because of the because of the wide open permits that had occurred prior to 1999.
So I have a couple clarifying questions about that.
Okay.
When did when was it open? Was it open, I guess, since the industry started? And then it closed in 1990, like you said. Can you specify also uh, in far offshore? Was that?
So there's the offshore trawl. There's trawlers that net the fish. Now the the commercial fishing and the nearshore fishery, where they want to take the fish alive, they're not going to use nets because nets will end up have dead fish. They're either doing hook and line or they do what they call fin fish traps. It's kind of like a crab trap, but it's more boxy, and the fish go through basically a little hole, and it kind of closes up and it traps the fish alive, and then they can pull those traps up, keep the fish alive in a tank, and get them back to shore and sell them, like say for $10 a pound or more, instead of $1.25 for a dead fish.
How deep was the near shore this offshore?
I've been out of it for a little while, but I'm going to say this is a very general answer to your question, and basically, excuse me, the area basically from shore to about a mile out is kind of considered the more sensitive area along the California coastline. We have what we call nearshore species, and by species, that's what's limited by permit. In other words, it's specifically the species that are taken. The regulations also tell the commercial fishermen where they can fish if it's in that nearshore zone or if it's further out. Um, and also, there's limitations on the time of year when you fish. So, all of these things, location, time of year, size limits, and poundage quota, become the managing factors in the nearshore fishery, and even with trawlers too.
And so, do you feel like that restriction or cutback of and the permits, the number of permits, was that helpful? Was that like a good regulation?
I do believe that cutting back the number of permittees that were operating at that time was a good thing. I think that the department's decision to look at, what they did is they looked at the prior years leading up to, the enactment of the regulations to see who was really in the industry making a living from it and who was a weekend warrior who was just going out and getting a commercial fishing license and putting a few bucks in their pocket each weekend. So I think that was a good thing. Yeah.
So, on the flip side, was there any bad regulations that you saw coming down the pipe as a fishing game yourself?
So I worked with another lieutenant that was running the Bluefin patrol boat, and he and I had discussed some of the regulations that were coming down. One of the regulations that came down the pike was they closed Morro Bay to the take of invertebrates. So basically, you couldn't take any clams in the bay. You couldn't take any mud shrimp in the bay. So, for example, you couldn't even take any mussels in the bay. They basically made it a marine, using the right term, but a marine preserve. And I remember discussing it with the patrol boat lieutenant at that time, saying, I'm wondering why they closed that off, that particular activity, because that's something that draws people to Morro Bay, and I don't believe there was any threat to the population of fish that, or I'm sorry, the invertebrates that existed. Gooey duck clams were basically you dig down in the mud and mud flats. Not everybody likes to do that. It's not like clamming for Pismo clams at Pismo Beach where you can take a fork. You got to get dirty. You got to dig down and get these clams. I don't believe it was overly harvested by sport anglers. Uh, Mud shrimp or ghost shrimp that were harvested, you dig for those, and they make great bait. Again, I don't think there was over harvesting of them, but they basically just made Morro Bay a no take zone. They allowed finfish um, angling in the north part of the bay, but I think they closed it off back toward Los Osos and that area where you can't take finfish now. And I guess we were kind of just scratching our head going, why did they do this? Again, we hope that regulations are based on good science. I know a number of years ago we had a director in the department said, hey, we're going to make our decisions and recommendations for laws and regulations to be based on good science, not on uh, political pull from one group or another. And I think that that was a good commitment. We just kind of questioned why they shut Morro Bay down. Again, that's just, I want to point out that's just a personal thought and not, a reflection of the Department of Fish and Wildlife or their opinion. So throw out that one caveat.
You- And have you ever, I guess, like worked with the fishermen, or have the fishermen advise you on how to make the laws because they feel that they're treated unfairly because the people making the laws aren't the ones actually fishing.
Right.
Did you ever have a
So
fisherman advise you?
the way that laws come about in the past, the really distant past, game wardens were more involved in making recommendations to the State Fish and Game Commission and to the state legislature, who enacts or makes the laws and regulations. Um, in my time with the department, we saw a shift where the biologists were the ones who were relied upon to make the recommendations, and game wardens not so much anymore. So the involvement in making regulations commonly would have involved either focus groups where commercial fishermen were invited to uh, bring input, or there would be public hearings where they would bring input into the making of regulations. Then the state legislature and the California Fish and Game Commission would make laws and regulations based on a combination of hearing the recommendations from the biologists and from public input, including the commercial fishing industry. And the commercial fishing industry is a political power. They're organized to provide input on what regulations are made, but they're not the only group out there that are making, um, uh, providing input. You've got groups, conservation, and I'd maybe call them preservation groups like the Sierra Club and other organizations that come from a different perspective, and they're probably asking for more restrictive. The uh, what was it? The coastal, the I was trying to say that bought up the permits. The Nature Conservancy that bought up the permits. They probably voiced their opinions and perspective to the state legislature and to the California Fish and Game Commission. So they're getting all this information and they make their regulations from that. A lot of, some of the regulations the commercial fishermen agree with. Say, oh yeah, I see why we did that. Um, some of them they probably don't agree with, and it probably rubs them the wrong way. And I understand their point of view. You saw closures that took place on various fisheries. For example, the crab traps and finfish traps that were out were shut down. Actually, I want to say that was actually at the federal. It was either federal level or state level, but anyway, it was shut down because of migrating whales. Migrating whales get entangled um, in the ropes that go from the trap on the ocean floor to the buoy that's at the surface of the water. We had a pretty spooky example of that. I took another warden out of Morro Bay, and we were just outside the harbor entrance. We saw a buoy with commercial marker on it, and we went to pull it, and it jerked back. And I'm going, what on earth is going on? And it jerked again, and the buoy got caught between the transom, the back end of the boat, and the outboard motor. We were on a smaller skiff, and all of a sudden we get dragged backwards through the water. It was like a scene out of Jaws. I don't remember that, boat getting dragged backwards by the shark. But anyway, we're getting dragged backwards through the water, and then it stopped. We were able to untangle it, and then about that time, a gray whale came up to the surface, and it had the rope through its mouth. Uh, Coincidentally, the Morro Bay Harbor Patrol happened to be all suited up with divers, and they were going to try to untangle that from the whale, which was quite an enterprise. But anyway, long story short, they were not able to do that, but they were able to get a tracking device so that actually U.S. Fish and Wildlife is responsible for gray whales, and they actually tracked it. And I'm not sure what the final outcome was on that, but that's what happens. And because of the migration, they'll shut down an entire industry, like the crabbing industry. Dungeness crabs got shut down for several months because of the migration. Well, so all of these things are things that compete with the commercial fishery and limit what commercial fishermen can do.
And how recent was that closure? Is that this year?
We've seen it over the past several years. I'm I've kind of been out of touch with the commercial regulations, but I do believe, and you certainly talk to the commercial fishermen that are dealing with the Dungeness crab, they can tell you, yeah, we had these periods of time. It might be a month, 2 months, 3 months that are shut down, and they can tell you what the most recent year was where this occurred. But it's been happening more and more.
You mentioned the fishermen are a strong political group. One thing that in talking with the fishermen themselves, and they feel that way. Do you think that maybe their power is waning, or do you think they still have the same pull that they did? And do you
Uh,
see them still showing up, I guess, to the meetings that you were talking about, but that kind of back and forth with the groups, Edge Conservancy or whatnot, to create these laws?
um, I don't know what level of power or influence that the commercial fishing groups have. I can just speculate that as we see less people in the fishery, you have maybe less of a voice. I mean, I would hope that they're organized enough to, um, you know, I'm not sure who's president of the Morro Bay Fishermen's Association. It was Mark Cognazzini, but uh, they could tell you what opportunities they have to speak to, members of the state legislature or the California Fish and Game Commission. But I believe they have, a fairly influential impact on regulations. But again, you have to take into consideration that we have an awful lot of environmental groups uh, that are very active with regulations that are proposed to the state legislature or to the Fish and Game Commission.
Do you think that these groups are making these decisions based on facts that biologists have about branch handbook or using this? Oh, this is why we're doing this, or do you think it's more, uh, I guess, as a flag, just like just wave the flag, like, oh, this is important, so we better take care of this, and they have funding behind them, because certainly Nature Conservancy is a big thing nowadays. Do you
Sure.
think that they're doing it smartly, I guess, or just like based on emotion?
Well, so I can't speak for the state legislature or the Fish and Game Commission. I can only tell you I would like to think that they're taking everyone's input. I would like to think that they're looking at our biologists and the wildlife surveys, the marine surveys that they do. Um, I would like to say that they look at the facts, the biological facts, the science, and make the decisions on the science. I hope it's not based on what is politically of interest at you know at a particular time. I don't know if that answers your question, but I'm not in the shoes of the state legislature or the Fish and Game Commission, but I would like to think that they look at the science in making the decisions.
What are some of the biggest challenges that you faced when getting into your job?
I'm not sure. Are you talking about like getting hired on the job?
Yeah, or
Okay.
I guess going around doing your daily duties. What are some of the biggest challenges that you faced?
Okay. Well, I'll back up to like getting hired on. Getting hired on to Fish and Game. This was in I became a reserve game warden in 1982. Um, like I said, I always, this was my dream job. As a kid, I wanted to be a game warden. I thought it was the best job in the world. And I thoroughly enjoyed, a 42-year um, involvement with Fish and Game, now Fish and Wildlife. Um, but having said that, it was really, really hard to get on to Fish and Game. At the time, they were hiring about 12. They would hire every other year, and during every other year, they would hire about 12 game wardens. I competed with 4,000 people all across the state for those 12 jobs. I think my first time I took the test, I got a 95%, and I died on the list. I just wasn't high enough. 2 years later, I tested, and I got a 97%, and I died on the list. And 2 years later, I tested, and I had a 99% on the test. And right at the end of the 2-year hiring cycle, they offered me a job. I said, "Yeah, I'll take it." So getting on Fish and Game was very difficult in the 80s. Part of that was that at that time the state was under the affirmative action program, so there was a real push through the program to get others that were not, white males and on the job. So I believe for like every white male that came on the job, you needed to have somebody from the underrepresented group to get hired. So that made it even more competitive. Um, Things have changed now. For example, the department was very small when I came on. Now I think we're up to about 400 game wardens in the whole state, and that's probably double the size when I came on. We're seeing a lot of the old timers retire, like one of them, and because of that, there's a lot more job openings. So I would put it this way: it's easier to get on Fish and Game or Fish and Wildlife now um, than it was when I first tried to hire on. You asked me about challenges on the job. Initially, the challenges really were, I had come from a police job to Fish and Game. I was used to having backup all the time, and if you needed another officer to back you up, got on the radio, they were there within a minute. Um, with Fish and Game, you're on your own. There's no one else except you for maybe an hour or 2 hours away. You may be in an area where you cannot get out on the radio to get out. And when I came on in '82, we didn't have cell phones. And to make matters worse, the radio that I had in my truck um, didn't go to any dispatcher. There was no one that, bless you, there's no one to answer my radio call if I called on the radio. So we ended up, the department had me put a radio in the house, and my wife became my dispatcher, and they put a state phone in our house. And I worked out of my house. I didn't report to any station. I was on my own. It was pretty crazy because uh, I, again, had no backup. And what I learned was this was in southern Monterey County. I learned to get to know the ranchers in southern Monterey County. And basically, if I needed help, I'd call my wife on the radio and tell her to call this particular ranch, and she had the number. The rancher would call the Cowboys. The Cowboys would get in their Jeep, grab their guns, and they were my backup. It was like something right out of the Old West. And that's how it was in the 80s. The department has modernized. We have got more funding than we had back then. And technology is so much more advanced than the 80s now. We have dispatch centers that the warden talks on the radio, and he's talking to a dispatch center down in Southern California, or there might be a dispatch center up in Northern California. It's all done through repeater lines and telephone lines. So technology has really advanced where game wardens are not as isolated as they used to be.
How do you feel the time has changed when you got into, or when you were, I guess, recreationally fishing, how easy it was for you then to get into just, I guess, fishing in general, and now, how do you see that was changed?
I think what has changed is the restrictions. This is from the sport perspective, but the restrictions on the time of year that you can fish. Knowing the zones, I provide that book on the Central California marine protected areas, and in this book, you'll find out that roughly about 16% of the California coastline is restricted in fishing. Now, 16% probably doesn't sound like a lot, but what I'm hearing from other sport anglers is those zones are oftentimes surrounding or very close to the areas where people have the opportunity to launch their small boats. Meaning, for example, there's all these zones you can't fish that are right off Morro Bay. There are some open zones, but as you have closed zones, it increases the fishing pressure on those open zones. Then there's a lot of open zones that are further up the Big Sur coastline, but who's going to take their small boat and at the price of gas go all the way up? And then when you consider marine weather conditions, are you going to take a small boat all the way up the Big Sur coastline to go fishing? There's some awesome fishing up there, but it's a long run, particularly if you have a small boat, to get all the way up the Big Sur coastline. And yeah, so those are some of the challenges that didn't exist when I started fishing as a boy. Also, there are restrictions that I have to stay abreast of as a sport angler to know. I just found out the other day, I guess, that vermilion rockfish, that's the bright orange rockfish, now you can only take two of them. I mean, it used to be that you could get vermilion were pretty common to catch, and you could have all 15, rockfish could be vermilion, but now you have this two fish limit by species. There's other issues that really confuse fishermen, and that's fish identification. So a vermilion rockfish, um, it looks a bit like a canary rockfish. Well, there's no take. I don't believe you have any take on canary rockfish. Canary rockfish kind of have that gray lateral line that's a little bit different than the vermilion rockfish, but you now have to become adept and competent at identifying fish species. Now, the good thing about it is I think our department has provided some really wonderful color plates that people could take with them fishing, so they can say, okay, I'm looking at this color plate. That's the kind of fish that I caught. I know it's okay to keep that fish. So, but there's more of an onus or responsibility on the part of the sport angler now to be to know, where can I fish, how many of a certain species can I take, um, what depth of water do I have to be in. That's the latest thing, is that the 50 fathom mark is becoming the new. Okay, I've got to be outside the 50 fathom mark. Well, 50 fathom mark is a ways out. That's 300 feet of water. So, uh, looking at the regulations, I checked them and actually talked to a friend of mine, and he says, "Oh, I see that they've actually opened it up where you can still fish inside, but it depends on the month. So there's certain months that you can be inside the 50. There's other months you have to be outside the 50. And again, it's just a whole myriad of regulations that the sport angler has to stay on top of so they don't get in trouble. A good friend of mine drifted into a marine protective zone, got a ticket by our patrol boat for a citation for being in the fishing in the marine protected area. So there's that. You've got, you know, you have to know that if you're a halibut fisherman or you're fishing salmon, you've got to fish those species. Uh, if before you take rockfish, if it's outside the zone, so you can't, for example, if they're saying, okay, you have to be in 50 fathoms of water to take rockfish, and you go out there, you catch a rockfish, and now you say, okay, well, I'm going to go switch up my gear and I'm going to catch salmon or I'm going to catch uh, halibut. You can't do that. You can't, if that zone is restricted to spot fish, you can't fish that zone, even though you're going after salmon or halibut headway. Sorry. Anyway, so you just got a lot of regulations on the sport fishermen and the commercial guys. It's the same thing. Commercial guys, I understand it's their business. There is a lot of regulations on it, but think of it this way: that is their business. Just like my buddy who's a contractor, he's a businessman too, and he builds houses, but he has to make sure that everything is to code. He has to check with the county, typically the planning department or the building inspector, and he has to make sure that everything he does is according to plan. The fishing industry is the same way. Um, the fishermen are taking a resource that belongs not specifically to them, but it belongs to the people of the state of California. So the commercial fishing license and permits that they have entitle them and give them a special privilege to take species that belong to the people of California. Does that kind of make sense?
On the topic of,
I guess, sir.
uh, the fish identification and then making sure that things are, if they are, size limit and catch limit and all that stuff. I've heard from fishermen that they need observers, like from the state. They need observers on their boats.
You're talking about the commercial.
Commercial.
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay.
They are required by the state to have observers to make sure they're uh, catching what they catch and nothing more. Were you ever part of managing that or seeing
So
any
I
problems or
I was aware of the fact I wasn't involved in you know checking with observers or that type of thing, but I was aware that observers were required. Guy in the back of my mind, I thought it was a federal regulation, not state, but I could be wrong on that. Um, Not only that, the all the commercial boats now, and I believe this was also a federal regulation, is that they have to have a signal device that is constantly showing where they are. And I have seen that at the federal level and seen their computers. They can look and tell exactly where every fishing boat is located at all the time. The thing has to be activated. Uh, the If they turn it off, they're in violation. They could lose their permit. So the fisherman has a responsibility of maintaining that signal device. So it's almost like having the observer on board, because it tells, and that device will also show how fast the boat is moving. So if the boat is in a closed zone, but you're seeing that they're moving at a relatively rapid pace, you know that they're not pulling a net or anything like that. If they're putting nets out, you're going to see, okay, their speed is consistent with you know operating a fish net. So um, they again at the federal level, I can tell you that this is highly regulated, and that's kind of why I compared it to somebody that's a contractor. A contractor's got to have everything inspected by the city or county to meet the building code. You have the same thing with commercial fishing.
do you think all this regulation has been necessary? Do you think that there are any, in your opinion, that are bad?
I'm not sure at this juncture that I'm in a position to really express an opinion on that, because I have to be honest with you. So when I retired from the department as a lieutenant in 2010, up until the 2 months ago, uh, during that time I worked background investigations for the department. I was totally out of the resource enforcement part of the department. I was doing backgrounds on new hires that wanted to become game wardens, and so I really lost touch with the marine end of things. And So I don't know what regulations are in effect other than what I may hear occasionally from other wardens that I talk to or what I see on the news. Um, so the question though was, do I think that all of these regulations are necessary? And if it's okay, I'd like to back up and talk about maybe some history. Um, the sardine fishery was, and I don't know if it is, but it was the biggest fishery um, off the west coast and maybe even the world. Sardines were harvested off the Pacific coast along the United States, down into South America, and also off the coast of South Africa. Sardines, I don't know if you're familiar with sardines. They're obviously they're small fish we often referred to as bait fish sometimes. Um, and they refer to their mass as biomass. They're they they swim in schools. If you've ever gone up to the Monterey Bay Aquarium, uh, you can see a spectacular display of these fish swimming in a circle. And anyway, there are literally millions of these fish. Well, what happened in the 1800s, mid to late 1800s, is, and particularly out of Monterey, uh, but all over the world, they were being harvested with nets, and they one of the nets that was most prevalently used in the 1800s going into the 1900s was what they called purse seines. Purse seines are a net where you identify where the school of fish is, you wrap or you run the net completely around the school of fish. You have floats on the top that floats the top of the net, and then at the bottom you have basically for lack of a better way, a drawstring that basically allows you to close the bottom of it. Now you have essentially a purse. That's what they call it, a purse seine. So these purse seiners would wrap an entire, you know, population or school of these fish and harvest them. And they were used initially as a food source, and it was a very popular food source going back again from the 1800s on into through World War II. But they were harvesting off the west coast, 175 what they call short tons, 250 thousand short tons of sardine, and and they would continue year after year. You're familiar with John Steinbeck, I'm sure. Um, John Steinbeck wrote a number of books. Camry Row. He was up in Monterey. There's a movie called Camry Row about the fishery in the 1920s. And anyway, basically the boats out of Monterey were getting the highest quality um, uh, sardines, and they were harvesting these fish initially for human food. Then they found out, hey, there's a market for them to be just ground up into fertilizer and into some sort of feed. I don't know if it was for animals or what it was, but chicken feed. I think it was chicken feed. Yeah. And anyway, so then the demand for sardines even became greater. And as I understand, there was one year where I think it was 700, almost or around 700 thousand short tons of sardine were harvested off the California coast. What happened, and this is an example of what happens when you don't have regulations. Fishing game was in effect. They were an age. They were a department back then, uh, and but they didn't regulate it, and people saw it as an endless supply of all these fish that they could take. Well, right around the end of World War II, going in, and then into the 50s, what we saw is just a super decline of fish to the point that they were getting. Uh, I mean, I've got a graph that can show you, but I think it's like 10% of what they got before. The the fish really declined, and you know the department and the scientists that looked at biologists that looked at this issue said, yeah, we have allowed the overharvesting commercially of these fish to the point that we're going to have a decline that may not recover. So the it had really declined in the 50s and up to about 1968 is when they basically stopped it and they did not allow any more harvest of sardines. Um, After that, I don't know when it was, but they saw the populations come back and they opened it up, but they kind of regulated. However, I've got a graph that shows how many sardine existed in 2019 compared to today, and it's like, again, it's probably like 2% of the population. We've seen a substantial decline. I don't know what the department's doing about the commercial take of sardine right now, but I suspect that they're limiting it. Again, they're doing what they did back in 1968, or they may be just simply limiting the number of people that are in it. But again, demand for the product commercially is what oftentimes leads to the decline uh, with with all species. There was a time when you could hunt ducks commercially and sell them. You've heard of the passenger pigeon. The last one died in uh, 1914 at the Cincinnati Zoo. It's extinct. Why did it decline? It was commercial hunting of the passenger pigeons used to fly across their flyways and would completely darken the skies, and it would sound. It'd be just a loud noise of the wings because there were so many birds. And everybody goes, "We could hunt these. There's no way we're going to hunt these out." The last one was shot. I'm sorry. The last one died in the I think it was Cincinnati Zoo in 1914. Commercialization, unregulated, will lead to decline or the extinction of species. We've lost, I think it's almost 500 species in the last 100 years. They're extinct, never to come back again. One of the species that did come back that we thought was extinct because of hunting practices back in the 1800s uh, was sea otters. Sea otters, they thought they were extinct. And back in the mid 60s, there was a couple at near Monterey. I'm trying to remember where it was, but anyway, they were out, with their binoculars, and they go, "I think that's a sea otter." Anyway, the rest of it is history. We obviously had a comeback with sea otters. Um, so the abalone divers didn't like that because sea otters do eat abalone, and that created a problem. But you know, again, abalone is another story. We basically we had regulations, but a combination of things led to the decline. I remember as a kid. I mean, I was an abalone diver myself, sport diver, and I went after abalone, and I love abalone. It's great, but we can't harvest abalone anymore because the numbers have declined. Again, I remember as a kid they used to use the abalone shells to stabilize the bank along some of the banks in Morro Bay, getting toward the state park. They used to stack abalone shells just for bank stabilization. Now you go to the store, you go to the shell shop, you can buy a abalone shell, but it'll cost you like $15-20. So again, it's a shot of decline. Again, for a number of reasons, not just commercial fishing, but you had the impact of the sea otters, and you probably had some other um, uh, environmental factors that probably came into play on that. So, I'm not blaming everything on over harvest, but it is a big factor.
Thus, I also did want to ask you about the abalone industry. Like when you were
Sure.
growing up, did you start fishing at the set or diving the same time as you started fishing? And how did it
I
look
was
like
fishing.
back then?
I fished at age 10. I was probably, let's say, my junior or senior year in high school. I remember buying my scuba tanks from a classmate of mine who was an avid diver, and so I got into scuba diving, spearfishing. I enjoyed spearfishing. and I enjoyed abalone diving. And um, yeah, there were some awesome places where abalone were back in the crevices off Pirates Cove, just south of Avila Beach, and these big red abalone, just a great place to get abalone. The north, I don't remember when they shut it down. If it was I remember if it was the 80s or 90s. Basically, they shut off all abalone harvest, even the sport, from San Francisco south. And then more recently, I understand that they've have it may be a temporary moratorium, but they have now limited or closed off the abalone harvest, sport harvest, north of San Francisco. Again, a lot of that has to do with the poaching that took place. Uh, you could on the black market you could get $100 for one abalone, probably more now. Where that was going was into there were markets in San Francisco where they would buy the abalone illegally, and and uh, so typically people, several years ago under sport license you could get three abalone. You can't sell anything that you got on a sport license. It's a very substantial fine, um, in the thousands of dollars. But people were selling them in San Francisco. And then you had people who were just out and out poaching. They would go out at nighttime, or they go out if it was in the daytime. They would get the abalone, they'd bring it to a point maybe near shore, get somebody to hide it in the bushes, and then they'd come back at night and retrieve the abalone and then get it to San Francisco to sell. That things like that, and again, that's commercialization of the resource. That commercialization really has an impact on the abalone. That's why I understand they may have shut it down now. I'm not absolutely sure, but I think they shut it down because of the abuses that took place up there. Fort Ross was a very popular place to go for abalone, and there was a lot of abalone up there. We didn't see the depletion like we saw here, so it's a great place to go. But again, you got a real problem with poaching. And it was just out and out poaching. It was not somebody who was licensed commercially to go get an abalone. It's just out and out poaching. So, yeah, those are some of the challenges that the department has faced. It's no secret we run undercover teams to go after people who poach and do things like that. And that the team's been pretty successful at getting, catching those people. And yeah, we go and we do get search warrants. So we go after illegally taken, illegally harvested uh, resources. That's a serious crime. So anyway,
What kind of abalone were you going for? Red?
reds were primarily red. Typically, were the largest abalone that we saw. I'm trying to remember what the size limit was. I want to say it was 7 inches back in the day. But every diver carried a gauge with them and would check the gauge. If it was smaller than the gauge allowed, you put that abalone back.
The where were you fishing, or where have you fished? I guess back, but both when you were boy and now, if you still go out.
As a kid, I probably limited most of my fishing to the bay, around maybe the mouth of the bay. I was 10 years old, and I had a 12 foot, a wood and fiberglass boat. Um, and it's not something that I would say is seaworthy to take out on the ocean. So my fishing was pretty much limited to the bay. As I got older and into adulthood, I got bigger boats, and was able to go up, to Cambria, places like that. And excuse me, I was able to go south. There's some great halibut spots off the sand spit off Morro Bay. There's some great spots to go after halibut out there. Um, I didn't get down to Port San Luis all that often. Coincidentally, I did. Yeah, I just didn't get down to Fort San Luis very often. But coincidentally, in 2016, I was approached and asked if I would like to be the interim chief of the Port San Luis Harbor Patrol. So I took that job for it was a temporary position for 9 months, and I got to know Port San Luis very, very well, and got a chance to run the harbor patrol there. That was a special treat. I thoroughly enjoyed that job. Those guys do a great job down there, and I learned a lot from them. So that was pretty neat. But I learned about other fishing grounds that are Port San Luis and south. They're pretty good. Uh, yeah, I knew some of those from the Marine Patrol when we were on the large patrol boat, and our responsibilities were the Channel Islands to the south and up as far north as Monterey from time to time. We did have assignments to San Francisco Bay, mostly after 9/11, and it wasn't about fishing. It was about um, concerns, attacks on soil, looking for bombs placed on the bridges, things like that. So we were running patrols 24 hours a day up San Francisco after 9/11. That was a very different time for the Marine Patrol. We actually had Coast Guard personnel on our boat. We didn't have the people, but we had the boats. Coast Guard was short having the boats, but they had lots of personnel. So we ended up working with the Coast Guard, and they would go with us on our boats and with that. A lot of people don't know this. The Coast Guard also enforces federal regulations, which the salmon regulations for salmon fishing are federal. Um, and we have state regulations as well, but they coincide with the federal regulations. Coast Guard enforces federal regulations related to fisheries as well.
And I'm going off that foreign, threats, I guess, line you were taking there.
Sure.
Have you observed foreign or international boats look up outside, like, far off our shore, but still kind of taking out the ecosystem and the populations out there, where, I guess it wouldn't be economical for a local fisherman to go that far out?
Yeah, they have I think it's called the EEZ, or the Economic Exclusion Zone, basically where the United States claims 200 miles out to sea. And uh, so as state game wardens, we're also federally deputized. So we're federally deputized under U.S. Fish and Wildlife to enforce the federal fishing regulations. And on occasion, we would run across foreign vessels. I didn't, but an interesting story. Uh, One of our other game wardens that worked on one of the other patrol boats shared was he said, this was during the Cold War, when they were checking vessels, there were foreign vessels that were in our EEZ area, the Economic Exclusion Zone, and within 200 miles. And our fishing game boat saw, the guys saw this Russian vessel. It's got a Russian flag flying on it. And they had some gear that looked like fishing gear, which would have entitled us to determine or regulate whether they're in the industry or not. But the guys also saw some really strange looking antennas on the boat, really strange ones. And they quickly concluded this was not a fishing boat. This was a spy vessel. They're spying on the U.S. And so they said, we're not going there. We're not going to go, we're not going to go deal with that boat. I remember the warden telling me that story, and I thought, oh, that's pretty interesting. I didn't know we'd be running into spy boats from foreign nations off our coast, but they're out there. They do spy. They use the proximity to monitor radio signals that are broadcast from the United States. So again, way out of my area of knowledge, but when we see things like that, we'll pass it on to the FBI or whatever. So, and that was something that happened after 9/11. There was a lot more direct communication with FBI's on foreign matters that we ran across.
True. starting to wrap this thing up.
Okay.
Is there any hope for continuation of commercial fisheries, in your opinion, as you've seen the obviously when you were a boy, there's so many boats there in the harbor, and now it's changed. You come back from your land job, and I see it's kind of dying out. Maybe I think there's,
I I
maybe
think
it'll
the
stick
num
around the local guys.
I think the number of people, when I look at the people that I grew up with, going to grammar school and high school, whose fathers were in the commercial fishing business, I see less of them in that, having their father hand off the baton to them so that they can take over the business. I see less of them. Um, as technology has developed, as certain experimental fishing practices are approved on a limited basis by the Fish and Game Commission or the state legislature. I suspect you're going to see some bigger boats. And we have seen bigger boats, maybe that are corporation owned in the fishery. They're going to be highly regulated in what they do. But as far as the number of boats, the mom and pop operations, if you want to call it that, the family businesses are not. I believe we're going to see a lot less of them. There could be expanding fisheries if commercial fishermen are prepared to shift their species of targeted species. If they're able to do that with the gear that they have, or changing out the gear, they may be able to change to different species. Uh, Species that never were harvested before are now being harvested, like sea urchins. Um, as a diver, sea urchins were just a pain, literally, because you land, you go down on your knees or something on the ocean floor, and you get a sea urchin spine in your knee, gets infected, and it's painful and not fun. Um, we knew if we smashed them up, all the fish would come around, and it's an easy way to track fish if you're spearfishing. Uh, and that was okay. There was nothing, illegal about that, or is okay. Now, though, sea urchins are actually a harvested commercial product that is used in some sort of, I don't know if it's the eggs or roe or what, I'm not sure exactly what part of the sea urchin is used, but anyway, it has a commercial value. And as commercial values develop, there'll be more harvesting of it, and then the danger of over harvesting. Have you heard of something called a slimy eel? Um, it's a disgusting looking thing that nobody would want to harvest, you'd think. But the again, overseas markets are creating a demand to catch these um, slimy eels, and they put them into big vats, and ship them overseas. And so, if people are prepared to shift their their target species, there's probably a chance that they can stay in the commercial fishing industry in some manner. But we just have more people um, having a bigger impact. There's environmental changes, as you know, that are being discussed, that are changing. Uh, I'll give you an example. There's a big debate about the warm water flow that comes off Diablo Canyon, and also used to come off the power plant in Morro Bay. Does that change the small part of the ecosystem? Yeah, it does. We have cold water here up north of Point Conception or Point Sal. It's a different marine environment than Southern California. You go off the beaches off Santa Barbara and that coastline north of there, you can get uh, you know spiny lobster, and we have a season for it, and it's awesome, take for lobster. Up here, no, we never saw any lobster. All of a sudden, we started seeing lobster off the the rock at Morro Bay where the outflow, where the warm water outflow was when PG&E was operating. So we're seeing lobster there, and I think the whole area off Dabla Canyon, I think that's all restricted for a couple of reasons. So I think it's part of the MPA, but also it's a security zone, so you can't go in there and you know look for lobster. But I would imagine it's probably a good place to find lobster. So anyway, um, but with that, we're seeing changes in different species based on water temperatures and things like that. Albacore is a big one. That's a big fishery. Um, that's been pretty wide open, but it's starting to get regulated commercially. And So any of the tuna species, there's going to be commercial regulations. Wasn't that many years ago where a sport angler could take as many albacore as he could catch. As he hugged his boat. That wasn't a good idea. I mean, how much albacore are you going to be able to process and eat? The chances are it's going to spoil before you process it all. As a sport angler, you're not going to have the facilities to handle that. So what was happening? You had sport anglers selling it on the side, a very serious crime. Selling sport catch is a serious violation, and so all of a sudden, people were selling their catch, as they came into Morro Bay at the laundromat. So, of course, the wardens worked that and made some cases related to that. Um, you know, the different tuna species, they migrate and cover just huge areas of our oceans. And as they migrate through, September, October is really a good period of time along our coast, and you can catch them. You know, um, Usually you have to get several a few miles out to the ocean to catch them, but they put up quite a fight, and they're great eating fish. But anyway, there's a concern that globally there could be an overharvest of them, and so you may see more regulations coming down the road on that. So,
Could you recommend me any places to fish as an inshore fisherman? That's not
so from a boat or from shore?
from shore.
Oh, from
Yeah.
shore. Should be giving away my secrets. There is some, well, locally, I'll put it this way for you viewers. Coleman Beach is that right next to the power plant. Um, just on the other side of the eelgrass, there's some great populations of perch, surf perch. Also, if you go just north of the Morro Bay city limits, the beach along there, a lot of people fish uh, both sport and commercially from shore. They fish surf perch there. So that's a good place. There's a couple spots up further up the north coast, getting up the Big Sur coastline that are pretty hot. But anyway, I might keep that one to myself. Anyway, yeah, there's some great spots for shore fishing. Yeah. Have you heard of poke poling? Okay. Uh, Poke poling is a great way to get some of your species near the shore. The state parks has acquired those bluffs north of Cayucas, and probably about a mile and a half, I'm going to say, north is that pullout. You see a lot of cars parked there. Excuse me. If you follow the ravine, there's kind of like a seasonal waterway, I guess, or a creek that goes down. If you follow that, you get down to the rocks, and you get out on those rocks, particularly the low tide, and poke pole there. You can get some really nice fish. I've seen cabezon. I've seen lingcod caught there, and there's some rockfish that have been caught there. But great way to do it from shore.
And what were some of your favorite memories in Morro Bay, either out in the water or maybe you're walking around on the shore?
I think for me, my wife thinks that I had a idyllic, unbelievable childhood because my I would go after school. I'd get out, I'd go jump on my boat that I kept out at the state park marina, and I'd go out and drop a line. I do my homework while I'm fishing, and and that was kind of my childhood, kind of a highlight, I think, of my childhood. And if my the, homework, the joke was with my mom, is if I didn't get that homework assignment in, oh, the pelican that landed on my boat should eat my homework. The joke was always, well, the dog ate my homework. Well, I had a pelican that liked to hang out on the boat. So, oh, the pelican ate. I didn't really use that as an excuse, but my mom enjoyed telling people that story. So anyway, I think that I could not have been more blessed to grow up in Morro Bay. I didn't appreciate the fog, in the summer. Um, I notice it's getting less foggy as the years go by in Morro Bay. Um, but uh, I kind of miss that. Um, just the ambiance, I guess, of the small town culture of Morro Bay. I called it Mayberry by the Bay from Andy Griffith's show. But anyway, um, it was a great place to grow up, and I kind of miss those simpler times. But yeah, Morro Bay is a great place.
Well, thank you, Dean,
All right,
for
thank
talking with
you.
me.
All right, you bet.